Hello students, today we're going to read chapters 5 and 6 of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. This book is full of very, very rich vocabulary. So before we start reading chapters 5 and 6, I want to go over just a couple of words that are really important to the story and will help us understand what's going on a little bit better. The first word is dashing. Dashing is an adjective, and we use it to describe how someone is attractive in kind of an adventurous, fancy way. So this picture is the perfect example of someone that we might think of as dashing. And as you think about Edward Tulane, I think you can imagine that this sentence that comes from the book, you can probably picture that this would be true of Edward. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite dashing. We already know that Edward is kind of fancy. He thinks of himself as a fancy, almost like a person, not just a toy. So I can see him being concerned with how he looks and thinking about how he appears to others. The other word that we're going to see in chapter 5 is mortified. A synonym for mortified would be embarrassed. And mortified takes the word embarrassed and makes it like 10 times worse. Like if you're mortified, you're not just embarrassed, you are really embarrassed. You want to run away, you want to go hide. So mortified, think about it being like embarrassed. In chapter 6, there's just, I think, one word that we want to look at, and that is the word blithely. Blithely is an adjective an adverb that describes you doing something in a cheerful way. And we're going to see in our story a sentence that says, far above him, the ocean liner with Abilene aboard it sailed blithely on. So it's saying that the ship sails happily along. And I would say that blithely means you're not only doing something in a happy way, you're doing it in a way where you're not even thinking about other people around you. You're totally oblivious. You're totally ignoring anything else that's going on because you feel so happy. All right, so let's go on and let's read the actual book, chapters 5 and 6. As I read, I'm putting the words here up on the screen for you to see, and I hope that you're tracking with your eyes the words because that can really help you with your own comprehension and with your fluency. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, so also that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she displayed it to him. Do you like this shirt with this suit? She asked him. Or, would you like to wear your black derby? You look very handsome in it. Shall we pack it? A derby is a fancy hat. And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward and Abilene and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock. On her head, she wore a floppy hat strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. Goodbye, Abilene shouted to her grandmother. I love you. The ship pulled away from the dock. Pellegrina waved to Abilene. Goodbye, lady, she called. Goodbye. Edward felt something damp in his ears. Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkled clothing. Does that make you think that Edward is really feeling empathy for Abilene right now? That he's worried about his clothing? Not her tears? Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved to see the last of her. I wonder why. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention on board the ship. What a singular rabbit, said an elderly lady with 3 strings of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances full of longing. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. "No," said Abilene. "I'm afraid that he's not the kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." Two young boys, brothers named Martin and Amos, took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long legs stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," said Abilene. "Does he wind up somewhere?" asked Amos. "No," said Abilene. "He does not wind up." "What's the point of him, then?" said Martin. "The point is that he's Edward," said Abilene. "That's not much of a point," said Amos. "It's not," agreed Martin. And then after a long thoughtful pause he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me neither," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits, and he has his own pajamas, too. They're made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing in off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. That's a hat. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite dashing. It came as a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf and then his jacket and pants were ripped from his body. He heard his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship, and then held upside down, he watched the watch roll merrily toward Abilene's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got underwear." He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see. "Take it off!" shouted Amos. "No!" screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear. Edward was paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassed glances his way. "Give him to me!" screamed Abilene. "He's mine!" "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Please," cried Abilene, "don't throw him. He's made of china. He'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could happen to him. Oh, but he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed in the same naked state from the hands of one grubby, laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back!" called Martin. Amos raised his arm, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. So it was that Edward did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. Wow. Think about what Edward must be feeling right now and what's changing for Edward from the beginning of the story. If we think about the setting, at the beginning of the story, Edward is in a beautiful home with people who love him. He's being taken care of. He's got beautiful clothes. And I wonder what's going to happen now that he's gone overboard the ship. Let's read on and let's see what's going to happen. Chapter 6. This is a boater. It's a straw hat that Edward was wearing. How does a rabbit die? Can a china rabbit drown? Is my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing out over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long way away, Edward heard Abilene call his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Come back!" Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled, ears over tail through the air, he managed to catch one last glimpse of Abilene. She was standing on the deck of the ship, holding on to the railing with one hand. In her other hand was a lamp. No, it was a ball of fire. No, Edward realized. It was his gold pocket watch that Abilene held in her hand. She was holding it up high, and it was reflecting the light of the sun. Poor Edward. My pocket watch, he thought. I need that. And then Abilene disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force that his hat blew off his head. Well, that answers that question, thought Edward, as he watched the hat dance away on the wind. And then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. He kept his eyes open the whole time, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. His painted-on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green and then to blue again. They watched as it finally became as black as night. Edward went down and down. He said to himself, "If I'm going to drown, certainly I would have done so by now." Far above him, the ocean liner with Abilene aboard it sailed blithely on, and the China rabbit landed finally on the ocean floor face down, and there with his head in the muck he experienced his first genuine and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid. Poor Edward, stuck in the muck. I wonder how he's going to get out of this one. We'll read on to chapters 7 and 8 to see what happens next.